Okay, so thank you again, Jasmine, for your introduction. I've got a few comments that I'd like to make on your report, but I'll throw it open to the committee first off. Any questions for Jasmine? Take that as a good sign or a bad sign. Anyway, Paul.
Can I just ask, in terms of our offer from Lewisham Southwark College, my understanding is that an awful lot of the target group of our young people who are living in Southwark are going outside of the borough in order to obtain that education. Just because our offer is poor, and indeed places are limited, even if it wasn't an offer, is not limiting these young people and what they're doing and where they're going. To what extent do you feel that that is a problem, that they're going out of borough? To what extent do you think that it is unproblematic? And to what extent should we be targeting a better offer, or indeed should the SOCO be targeting a better offer at people not just in borough but outside of borough as well? Because it is obviously a concern that we're not the centre for that kind of stuff. But what meaningful impact is it having on our young people, particularly those people in terms of narrowing the gap?
I mean, that's a really good question. It's obviously it would be a moot point really, because on one sense, you know, the apprenticeship is on its way now, and that seems to be the beacon. But having said that, you know, I'm of an age where further education was very important to me, you know, personally, and enabled me to, you know, achieve things that I probably wouldn't have achieved without further education. I haven't seen any radical changes in social policy which would mean we can afford not to have a good further education offer to, you know, pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, you see what I mean? So personally, I would think it's quite important that we have that locally, you know, as a bare minimum. Do you see what I mean? So, but if you ask someone else on the committee, you might get a different answer, but certainly I think it's, you know, very important. That's not to say apprenticeships won't be any good. In fact, they'll be great, you know, but having said that, we do need to hit on all bases when you're dealing with this level of deprivation.
Am I right in thinking that recommendations 13 on basically widening provision of local sixth forms, is that to some extent a response to the problems that are being experienced by Lewisham Southwark College?
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Catherine.
Thank you very much for the report. It's clear that loads of work has gone into it, and that there's been quite a diverse way in which you've gathered the information. And I think that the work of the policy seminar has obviously been really successful in bringing people together and having that kind of cross mixture of ideas as well. But when you did the survey originally, you didn't have a great response from people, because that was only 17 out of 103, and quite a lot of the recommendations will need to be quite far-reaching. Do you feel like you've reached further beyond the survey in the rest of the work? And some of the recommendations are about, the ones that particularly just struck me around kind of engaging in working with low-income parents, which is obviously going to be a wide-reaching, something that will need to happen quite across a number of different places, and there isn't a full kind of scope about what that would look like, which is kind of fair enough. But I'm just wondering about what perhaps you've learned about engagement as part of this process.
Okay, great question. Yes, you're right about the survey. I mean, in fact, this is why it was a sprawling beast, because we were waiting for the surveys to come, and then we even got everyone from the committee to ring ahead that you knew in order to get more and more. So I was trying to attack it from a brisk managerial fashion. But even that didn't crack it, because obviously schools, we've got so many different tenures of schools, and then plus, you know, the things that the Tories did, they tried to, you know, separate schools from local government. Obviously that will never work, because our interests don't stop at the school gate. But nevertheless, a lot of schools are thinking that they didn't have to respond. Now then, one of the things that we did to substitute that was to work with the Southwark Teachers Executive. So we did have an audience with head teachers, finally. But yes, there's a lot to say about engagement, and that's something that I've taken up with the lead member on how we work better with schools, really. So that's an ongoing thing that we'll have to do. Now, coming back to your point about how you get some of these recommendations right round the schools, you know, it's just very good practice. And I suppose from a selfish perspective, schools are interested in their Ofsted results, so that's something that you can, you know, really make sure that they listen to these recommendations. You know, they should be engaging parents, low-income parents. And the fact that we've got that, these great examples from Bacon's College, you know, that have been, you know, put up there by Ofsted, you know, so I think that's a good way, because schools not so keen to overtly be answering questionnaires, but they do want to lap up good practice wherever they see it. So I'm reasonably optimistic about that recommendation.
Great. Thank you. Johnson.
Just to echo Catherine's thoughts, and I'm sure everyone will agree with me, it's a really, really good report and a lot of great recommendations there. Following on from Paul's question, actually, was wondering, do you know if you come across any boroughs who are not necessarily doing it well, but you could say we can model on, or we could be able to point to and be able to say, you know, they're doing an ST, they're doing it quite well. And secondly, in terms of, I'm not sure it would be a recommendation, but long term, it would be, do you have any thoughts on how it could be measured, and how what would work well for you in terms of how we could look back and say, you know, this has worked or this hasn't worked, and how frequent would that be? Just
yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but in our other remit, the policy group that we are on, you know, we've got a separate policy group to look at some of these issues. So it didn't come out of this research, but we said actually we did want to see what good FE, you know, what it looked like, felt like, and you know, what are the components. And one of the things that we wanted to see is that, you know, maybe one of the new cabinet members could do that, but someone to just go and have a look, you know, and do a deep dive into local authorities that are, you know, very happy with that offer, you know, to incorporate good practice where we could, really. So that's an ongoing thing. So that's very astute of you to point that out. In terms of any local, or anyone that I would put up as a beacon, there are many, but I don't really feel, you know, that I know enough to say that they are, you know, the best ones, but we should be talking to them and collecting that information. But I haven't had, you know, the opportunity to look that externally yet.
Rose.
Thank you. Yes, thank you again for the report. It's really interesting reading. So both of my questions are sort of essentially about how we share some of the best practice which you've learned about in the report, and you've touched on a little bit of this already. But I mean, firstly, you mentioned that Bacon's College has a particularly good program for kind of help supporting students who are going through kind of emotional or behavioural difficulties. Yeah. And I just wondered if you know, came across during your during the work on this, what work the council either is already or potentially could be doing with Bacon's College to make sure that that best practice is shared with other schools. And then secondly, you also mentioned the kind of impact that the pupil premiums have in terms of contributing to closing the attainment gap. And as all the schools obviously have to publish how they spend their pupil premium money, I also wondered if you know whether the council are already working on kind of collating, again, the information about the best ways that that's been used. So again, that can be shared with other schools.
Yes, I mean, all that information will be available. From my previous job, I know that you can just go onto the DFE website and you can collect that information. But I'm not sure if anyone's doing that, but, you know, it's a good idea. I mean, I thought, you know, in my naivety, that all of these schools would be telling me to, because that was one of the questions. I do know that the lead member is all over this, you know, Councillor Mills. She basically, she engaged with this very positively, and she is basically sits with the head teacher's executive, so she will make sure that a lot of this good practice is spread. We're also having a council assembly, so I'm sure some of this will come up there, hopefully. So yes, that's how we're spreading it, really. But any ideas that you've got from your experience, you know, we can put in the report before it goes to Cabinet.
Thank you.
I think
Yeah, sort of already a bit covered, but I'll say it anyway. So at the beginning of your intro, you kind of said it's quite difficult initially to get buy-in in terms of, you know, oh, we're already doing really well, you know. And I was just wondering what your plan was, and obviously you just outlined it a bit, and it's great that, you know, Councillor Mills is on board with it. But kind of making sure that despite the fact that you've got this kind of 70 to 30% agency, for example, and your goal is making it 100%, what's your sort of plan, or what are your hopes for how that can actually, how you can keep that up the political agenda in such kind of difficult times financially, and you know, there's so many different imperatives struggling on the list of things. How can we? I personally think it's incredibly fundamentally important that we do. So I was just sort of wondering what your angle's going to be, and how you'll be able to maintain that momentum.
That's a really good question, and I think in the current climate, at the time of writing, you know, I did think that we might have a change of government, but in the current climate, I think, you know, I mean, I asked this question of Margaret Hodge, actually, you know, how you hold all the schools accountable to, you know, these kind of targets. And she said that we have to carry on regardless, and the role of scrutiny is where any of these, I feel like I should be looking at the camera now, where any of these schools, you know, are not performing, and they are, and the gap between, you know, the most disadvantaged and the wider population in the schools is widening, that we have them in scrutiny, we hold them to the account, and, you know, we tip the balance, and they have to tell us exactly what their moves are to narrow the gap. So we just have to carry on regardless, really, putting pressure. And, you know, there are some companies out there, some that we've had in overview and scrutiny, that feel that they don't want to relate to the local authority, but that's a thing that we can positively be doing. We can be, you know, scrutinising and poring over these results, and the minute that it looks like it's going the wrong way, we'll get them in and put pressure on them. Or I'll point them out and you lot will put pressure on them.
okay. Tom.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. Couple of things. One in recommendation 9, and apologies for not getting to your seminar. I didn't get to some of the stuff around housing, but you know, it says improving communication between schools, housing, probation services, and the police. Just wondering, in terms of that, whether you've got any plans to measure that or to look for those improvements, and whether there's anything in terms of joint working, you know, we've talked a lot about joint working tonight, because housing and the police fall under the areas of my subcommittee, and we'd be happy to look at that with you. And just on the section on further education, as a Camberwell council, I'm very aware of Lesoco's plan to close in Camberwell, and you know, so that's one of what, 2 sites in Southwark, you know, and it's the only site that's particularly accessible to large deprived parts of the borough, and the demographic of students at Camberwell as well has been shown to be people looking for basic maths and English skills and so on. So I wondered whether you would be updating to include the fact that that's under threat, or whether that's something you might be looking at later on.
Thank you for that. I definitely should, and I'll take that recommendation up to date. I think that's right. We have to flag that up in the report. And on the joint working, I think really I didn't think of inviting any officers. Because I invited you and I invited, you know, Councillor Livingstone. I thought I had it covered, but it's so. And also because housing is very busy firefighting a lot of the time. I think we just have to make the capacity, and I think that we have to lead by example. We have to show the officers and the organisation that we are seamless, and that's why some cross-cutting work between us will be really, really good. Because, you know, one of the things about that policy seminar is that people, you know, didn't realise that there were so many divisions between the service, so anything that you can do to help. And I think that's how we're going to have to do it. We're going to have a united front and show the officers that it's just not permissible, really, to have big chasms between, because actually, how can you achieve if you've got no secure housing. You know, that's it's one of the most obvious things, but not out there, unfortunately. So it's up to us to lead by example.
Okay, thank you for that. So Tom annoyingly stole one of my questions, so which was about recommendation 9. The only other points that I wanted to make were the first is a bit pedantic. In recommendation 8, on the summary page, it says by ensuring that schools have a consistent link. I'm presuming that means consistent.
Yeah.
And the other point was recommendation 5 about bringing that research to the attention of local schools through the education department and the head teacher's executive. I just wanted to ask you, with regard to the head teacher's executive, is that about getting it onto the agenda of a specific meeting? Is that what that means?
I think it is, and it's an ongoing thing.
Okay. And who sets that agenda? Do they set it themselves, or does the
do.
council have an input into that?
No, they set that themselves, but they've got really good relationships with, well, now they've got good relationships with Councillor Mills and also ourselves. You know, we've got regular contact with them, which is, you know, really excellent.
Okay, good. So, I mean, it is a really excellent report with a great set of recommendations. So, the one point that was made there about the Camberwell site, and it sounds like you're happy to include that in your recommendations. So my suggestion would be that we then send this to the Cabinet, but with the addition of that recommendation. We'll leave it to you to finalise the wording of that. It doesn't need to come back to us again.
Okay, thank you.
So
what's
the recommendation around the Camberwell site?
That it's about opposing it.
Okay.
A kind of a symbolic position.
Okay, fine.
Yep. You like concrete recommendations.
And okay, so fantastic. Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you. Thank you for your input, Chair, and everyone. Thank you.
Brilliant. Congratulations, it was an excellent report. So moving seamlessly on again to the next report, which is Southwark's adoption service.
Okay.
Another fascinating piece of work. Again, I'll hand over to you to give us an introduction.
Okay, it won't be for long because it's a little bit more, not uncomplicated, but a bit more straightforward because it's one clear area. I think the first thing to say is, and there are many lessons for scrutiny in this approach, I think, because when we started, we thought we would look at adoption as a review, and of course, it's like such a it's a government priority, as people will know. You remember Michael Gove told everyone that he'd been adopted, and then they got Ed Timpson up, whose mum had basically fostered 94 children, and you know, I've actually met him, and you know, he just seemed very committed to it, but they made a lot of changes, and they had adoption under the spotlight. So one of the things that we thought is we'd look at how Southwark, you know, how we responded to that gear change. Now, because they had so much information, they have to report every movement to central government. You would think they'd think, wouldn't you, that the adoption service might think when they come to scrutiny it's all right to keep giving us that information because they're collecting it anyway. So we keep getting the reports, and it was that adoption scorecard report, and it's a bit like quantity, and you know how you see beneath it. So in the end, out of exasperation, I thought, right, we have to attack this. Sorry about the language. We have to look at it from another angle, really.
Approach.
So yes, another approach. And that approach was we actually gave up with the officers a little bit and just spoke to a focus group. So we got adoptive people, and then we got quite a good approach with the officers because we decided to think a little bit more innovatively. We got a kind of respect from the officers then, and then you get into a realm where you're doing scrutiny jointly. Do you know what I mean? It's not them and us, but you're jointly trying to improve the service through scrutiny. So I think we got there. Anyway, so when you talk to people, you get a different perspective on things, and we learned quite a lot about our adoption service because, in one sense, a lot of the reforms meant that people would get assessed very quickly, you'd get matched very quickly, and actually there's nothing prohibiting if you smoked, if you were old, or if you were white and you wanted to adopt black children because there were so many black children in care, 65,000 children in care all looking for homes, get rid of the things that are blocking them. So a new approach. What I couldn't quite figure out was how Southwark, which is one of the most diverse local authorities in the country, didn't have, why we weren't the best local authority at adoption. And so one of the things that we looked at is, basically we'll come to the recommendations in a minute, but what was the experience of people adopting? And the first thing that I have to say is that it's very positive, that actually people that come to our adoptive service speak very highly, of Southwark, the council, and the approaches. What we were able to glean is that there is room for improvement.
Yeah.
The stuff around our contact work, that was very clunky, and people felt that they were subliminally getting the idea that they might be the wrong colour. And there were some interesting observations from the group there that actually they wouldn't be able to adopt here because they were white, and so you've got that. So we had to unpick that a little bit. Story work, life story books. If people aren't familiar with it, these are the books that if you're adopted now, the idea before, you might not tell a child till they were 18, not before the reforms, I mean much earlier than that was reformed, so that you'd have a book, and best practice is you have this book and the photographs of the child from birth to foster carer to adoption. And some of the things that we saw were actually the parents were reporting that there were addresses and things which were totally inappropriate to be in that book that you would share with the child. So we learnt a lot from that. So anyway, there we have it. So we come to the recommendations, and when we fed that back, as soon as we did the focus group, this was another thing. It's all fine and well talking to people out there in the name of scrutiny, but what you have to do is you must have respect for the officers that are running that service. As soon as we had that focus group, and you have to follow it through, I just ran straight up to the fourth floor and I just, typed out all of the things and fed them back, immediately that day to the service providers, because you can't wait for the next cycle of meetings and leave people on tenterhooks what have people said about their services. So we did that. We had a good discussion, and some of these recommendations were implemented straight away. So, you can agree the report, but, common sense prevails and people are getting on with it. Now then, the recommendations, I'm not going to read them all, but I do want to say, I did want to report one more lesson as well to, the focus groups and everything, is that when you're doing these reviews and you're looking at scrutiny, you get this qualitative data and quantitative data, and you can miss a lot through the scrutiny process. So I think the thing that Gavin was saying, appoint 2 people to lead on some of the interviews you do with officers and cabinet members is probably a good idea, because through doing the review I was like sticking my pencil and looking, that doesn't sound right. So it makes for a better report really, and we do add value to the service. So coming to the recommendations, I think the idea is that we get Southwark to be the best local authority in the country when it comes to adoptions, and that we have a service that isn't blind to national and ethnic differences, but is not transfixed by them either. And these are very important messages to get out to the workforce really. And there we see the link between the work we do on scrutiny, and so that it's not just in the scrutiny process going round and round, that we actually get these ideas and this thinking out to the organisation. One of the things that the policy seminar did is that I got someone that we interviewed, an adopter, who basically saw a gap in our services. She saw that there wasn't really anywhere to go. When you have a baby, your own baby, you have this network, you meet people at the antenatal clinic and you have this gang. But if you just have a baby when you adopt, you have this baby and you don't really have that network. Obviously you meet people eventually, but this, Miranda, she is an adoptee from Southwark, and she just set up this network group, which is hugely successful, and it's spreading around the country now. All local authorities are leading from us. So I got her to feed back some of this at the policy seminar, and people who felt that they didn't want to come to a policy seminar that was like putting all these different subjects together, their education, their attainment, they came up to me after saying that they learned such a lot about that, you know, the adoption experience and how they could improve in schools. So anyway, in a nutshell then, the recommendations are there on page 49, and I think really it's, you know, it's about all of us, you know, spreading this good practice and this gear shift really. And I think one of the things that the head of service said, of the adoption service, is that he's never been so scrutinised in his life, but I have to say that he felt all the recommendations were excellent, you know, that it was an appraisal that he was running a good service, but he could make this, you know, a beacon really. You know, so that's it. And the link with education, which I probably didn't, it was probably a Freudian slip on my part because I'm an adoptive mum, but one of the things for the education thing was that we've got this woman in from PAT UK, Pregnancy and Adoption, and she said that the outcomes for children that were adopted mirrored more like the outcomes for children that were looked after, which are notoriously poor. You know, so that's something that we really have to do something about. You know, so there's some shocking stuff in there, and so there's room, you know, it's hard to talk about it without getting quite emotional really, but there's, you know, it's very important that we learn all of these recommendations and get them into the organisation as quickly as possible really.
Thank you, Jasmine, and congratulations again on a great piece of work. I'm just going to jump in with one quick question. So a number of these recommendations, you know, they're spot on. I can see why you've made them. And some of them are turned more in as principles. You know, you want us as an organisation to adopt these as principles of best practice, which is quite right. So looking at it from the point of view of the cabinet member who's going to be responding and what you want to be looking for in that response, is there a danger that they might be able to just not be as specific as you want them to be, you know, because you've stated it as a principle rather than that, you know, this particular part of the organisation needs to do this particular thing more often. Presumably that's something you've thought through and this is done in a deliberate way. Could you just tell us a bit more about that?
Because it's all about culture change, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? You can change legislation till you're blue in the face, and you can get people to give, you know, spend 40% of their time, if you're a head of service, collecting data. You can do all of these things, but the reality is, the face on the head of service, when I explained some of the experiences, you know, I mean, basically, it is about culture change. If you're not winning those hearts and minds, then there's no point. We've got recommendations on this up to our eyeballs. We've got to change the culture. We've got to try and make sure the best we can do that the social workers that we employ, you know, understand exactly what they're doing. You know, you can't go ahead in the whole old way anymore. You can't give subliminal messages that actually they've read books and they've done, you know, degrees on why it might not be a good idea for white people to adopt black children. Well, actually, that's all changed now. And if they're not getting it now from, you know, legislation, then we have to make sure that we change the culture. And I think sometimes, in order to change the culture, it is about being, not woolly, some people may think that, but you have to challenge the way people are thinking, and that's what I think these recommendations do. I think they're like a, you know, like a campaigning sheet in one sense.
Okay, no, that's very useful. Catherine.
Thank you again for the report. One on 7.5, following the policy seminar, one of the recommendations was asking about adoptive parents being empowered to take more choices, and that then is picked up in the recommendations several down this one. And in that you've got one that places the voice of the adoptive parents at the heart of the services, empowers them to make more choices and gives them a voice throughout the process. So, I wanted to know what those choices are, because I don't know what that means really. But also, I wasn't really sure about placing the voice of the adoptive parents at the heart of the service, because you sort of, frame it like that, outweighing the voice of the adopted child, and that slightly bothered me.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important to at least to actively listen to or understand the experiences of adoptive parents, because I think that's kind of the spirit of what you're talking about. But don't kind of, the adopted child is actually the heart of what's going on, but the adoptive parents definitely need to be their experiences need to be understood. So.
Yes, that's right. But that was more about the experience of the adoptive parent and the service, not so much about the child, but throughout the process, even when there is no child, you know, at the beginning of the assessment process, because quite often what happens, and this hasn't changed in the government gear change, is that people want to make sure, what are you made of in order to adopt? They want to make sure that you're not faint-hearted and that you're going to buckle at the first problem. You know, because a lot of children will have a lot of, you know, issues to deal with. So there's almost like this test that they will make the adoption process look like doom and gloom, and that you're going to end up with a child with so many multiple issues and everything, that it actually puts quite a dampener on the whole assessment process and makes people feel, it's almost like designed to push people out, you know, to get people running in the opposite direction, and if they're still here for the next meeting, then they're worthy of adopting. So I think it's about getting people to be a bit more proactive, getting people more engaged.
So the choices, what are the choices?
Well, the choices are, you know, where they go in the assessment process, really, and, you know, their work around, you know, basically their work in the package.
I still don't really.
Yeah. I'll have to redraft some of that actually to make more sense of it. But it is more about the, you know, the voice of the person.
Participants or something.
Yeah, so that they're engaged in the process as opposed to just being the, you know, in this assessment process.
Rather than passive.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, yeah, that's well spotted and it's sloppy drafting, so
these things always happen in the other committee meetings, don't worry. Rebecca.
Jasmine, I think it's a really good report. One of the things that I don't know whether you looked at it or not was how successful our advertising of our adoption services is, and kind of the Facebook messages and the kind of advertising boards and things, and whether that's had an impact and kind of what impact it had, if it did, and how successful it is as a tool for increasing interest in adoption.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and that's something that didn't come up in the focus group, but it did actually, and in fact I should put that in, because I'd forgotten that one of the service managers, because I was so listening to the actual recipients of the service, did raise that, because Lambeth have this amazing video. I don't know if anyone of you've seen it, but they put a lot of money into it. It's like an epic production, and I saw it at the Association of Directors Conference, which is like a massive affair, and they just put this film on. They didn't really introduce it, but very quickly it was a black man getting ready, putting, you know, his shirt on, getting ready, you know, to go to some event and everything, and then you flash back at the family and you didn't quite know what was going on, but then he walks into the house. There's a bit more to this, but he is actually Prime Minister and he was a child in care, do you know what I mean? So you can imagine how powerful that image was, really. But we, you know, we haven't put as much money into our comms and so we're kind of, you know, we do need to do more. We're doing okay with that, but we probably need to put more money in it, and there's time when we haven't got money, but obviously...
Well, I think one of the things might be around targeting. I've had people say to me, oh, I don't live in Southwark, but I've got this weird advert on Facebook advertising that I should, and yeah, it was someone that is kind of a grandparent. We were being advertising to a grandparent service about adoption. So is our targeting right, and how are we doing it? And is it because they just happened to click on something else on our website that they ended up on our list?
Right, okay.
And how do we make sure we're actually talking to the right people about the services?
Okay, well, yeah. That's a good. Yeah. Well, I'll leave that with me. But
as far as it's practical, you'll take a look at that.
Yeah, we will look at that.
I don't know. Yeah, if it's something you can look at, or whether it falls into more of a digital type thing.
And we should definitely add something on that now and flag it up in the recommendations. Thank you, Rebecca.
Paul.
I suppose there were two things, both of which have been partially covered by Gavin and Catherine. The first thing to say, I mean, things as I understand your reasoning and the conclusion you come to having the aspirational charter style approach in your recommendation. Perhaps I might suggest that a concrete recommendation would be that this becomes a charter, and that there is a charter against which all principal decisions are measured, and are we genuinely actively encouraging? Is this action, is this policy encouraging people to actively adopt, to encourage that culture change? And then that seems to be a nice halfway house between a specific recommendation that affects culture change and these general aspirational things which do. The other thing that I say, which kind of picks up from Kath, is there are obviously issues in terms of how and where and why you can and effectively engage with young people who are in care or who've been in care recently and have been through the Southwark process. It would be good to hear about whether you explored that and what barriers you came across in terms of talking to them. And I think that with the recommendations, whether it's a charter or not, a reference to the voice of those children and how we do that, and ensuring that they are consulted at whatever age they are at in an age-appropriate way, and that their experience is at the heart of it is quite key. But yeah, your experiences on that will be useful.
Yeah. I mean, to be quite honest, I was just pleased that we managed to get the families, in the time frame. But you're absolutely right. The voice of the child is very important. But I think that's something that we could flag up for later. Or I think one of the things that we're going to be looking at, hopefully, is the offer that we have to young people, and that will be our first point of call now. Having learnt from this, we'll just go straight to the young people and find their experience. But yes, you're absolutely right. But I think it was about maybe timing.
Okay, thanks. Johnson?
Just to echo fellow members' thoughts again, I very much appreciate the work you've put into this. Wanted to ask, do you feel there would be any leg, or do you feel there'll be, does this consider already having what we currently offer to, because this comes across as it's for the traditional nuclear family, is there any look into if it's the same experience, if you're saying
diverse than that it probably looks, but yeah, we did take that into account. But obviously, because we just